Hello guys, get comfortable, close your eyes, and imagine the cold stone floor of a medieval infirmary. The air smells faintly of rosemary and old parchment. As we drift into this quiet story about medicine long ago, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us keep whispering history to sleep. It's nighttime in a small monastery infirmary. The hour is late, and the world outside is hushed. Through a narrow, arched window, a pale moon casts its silver light onto the flagstones, and somewhere in the convent garden beyond, an owl gives a solitary hoot. Inside, the air is heavy and still, almost sacred in its quiet, broken only by the occasional crackle of the candle wick, or a muffled cough from a sleeping patient. A single candle flickers, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. In the dim light, a weary healer leans over a wooden table cluttered with parchments and dried herbs. He is a medieval doctor, though in these days he might simply be called a physician, or if he is a monk, the infirmarian. His back aches from hours of tending the sick, yet he continues his silent routine. Listen to the soft grinding sound as he crushes rosemary, thyme, and a little willow bark with a mortar and pestle. The soothing scent of the crushed herbs mingles with the waxy smell of the candle. This gentle aroma is one of the few comforts in a world where illness often outpaces cure. Nearby, on a straw-hilled cot, a patient lies shivering under a woolen blanket. The doctor moves quietly to check on him. He places a cool hand on the man's forehead. Fever. The patient's skin is hot and damp with sweat, despite the chill of the stone-walled room. The physician frowns faintly, worry lining his brow. Fevers are common and mysterious afflictions. In his leather-bound notebook, one of his most prized possessions, he has recorded many such cases. By the glow of the candle, he notes the patient's condition. The heat of the skin, the color of his urine in a ceramic chamber pot by the bed, the faint rattle in his breath. There are no laboratories or advanced instruments here. Only the doctor's senses and the ancient teachings he has memorized guide him. In this quiet moment, you can almost hear the doctor's thoughts. Perhaps he whispers a prayer under his breath as he works, asking for guidance or mercy. In early 1200, medical knowledge is as much about faith as it is about learned practice. For centuries, healing has been a sacred duty and an arduous trial. Tonight, as the patient moans softly, the doctor reaches for a small bowl of herbal infusion he prepared earlier. Steam rises from the warm mixture of chamomile and mint. Gently lifting the patient's head, the doctor coaxes him to sip. The warm tisane might soothe the fever, or it might not, but it's the best he can offer with the knowledge at hand. This medieval healer is not alone in his efforts. Across the countryside and in towns, many others dedicate themselves to the art of healing in these dark times. Some, like him, are learned physicians who have studied the old texts. Others are simple barber surgeons with rough hands and sharp knives, plying their trade on blood-stained tables. And then there are the wise women and apothecaries, tending gardens of medicinal herbs and mixing potions in clay jars. In candlelit cottages, midwives cradle newborns and tend to mothers in childbirth, bearing ancient knowledge passed from woman to woman. All of them, physician, surgeon, apothecary, midwife, share the same burden. The struggle to heal in a world where pain and sickness are constant shadows. Imagine stepping out of the little infirmary and into the cool night air of a medieval town. The narrow street is silent at this late hour, save for the distant sigh of wind. Under the moonlight, the timber-framed houses huddle together against the dark. You walk slowly on uneven cobblestones, past shuttered market stalls and the dark outline of a church steeple. On one corner stands a small shop marked by the sign of a mortar and pestle, the apothecary symbol. Even now, the apothecary might be awake, grinding ingredients for a restorative balm or measuring out dried rose hips and sage for someone's cough. Apothecaries are the pharmacists of this era, though the line between pharmacist and physician is blurred. They prepare salves, syrups and powders from plants and minerals, learning through apprenticeships and jealously guarded recipe books. The smells of fennel, anise and lavender cling to their clothes and drift from their shop doors. Their hands are stained green from herbs and black under the nails from mixing charcoal poultices. Further down the road, you notice a faded red and white striped pole by another doorway, a sign of the barber surgeon. Inside, if it were daytime, you'd find a man who cuts hair and shaves beards, but also sets broken bones and pulls rotten teeth. In the same chair where a customer sits for a trim, another might grit his teeth while the barber surgeon lances a boil or applies leeches behind the ear to relieve a raging headache. His tools hang on the wall, silhouetted in the hearth's glow, gleaming metal scalpels and hooks, an amputation saw and irons for cauterizing wounds. He cleans them by a quick wipe of wine or a pass through the flame when possible, but true sterility is a concept centuries away. Still, he does what he can, sharpening his blades, keeping them free of visible rust. On a wooden shelf lies a bowl stained with blood, evidence of a recent bloodletting. Perhaps earlier that day, a patient came in, flushed and feverish, and the barber surgeon opened a vein in the patient's arm to drain some blood, hoping to release the excess heat from the body. These healers, the apothecary, the barber surgeon, the learned physician in his robes, the wise midwife with her herbs, form a patchwork of medical care in medieval society. They often work separately, sometimes mistrusting each other's methods, yet together they represent the only hope the sick and injured have. In the darkness of the medieval night, each might pause in their own modest dwellings, reflecting on the patients they saw that day. They whisper prayers not just out of piety but out of desperation, because even the most skilled healer knows the limits of their art. It is a humbling profession. To be a doctor or healer in this age is to live with uncertainty and to stand at the fragile boundary between life and death every day. In the stillness of these nights, the physician's mind often wanders over the teachings that guide his work. Every medieval healer, whether learned doctor or lowly barber, shares to some extent the same fundamental theory of the human body, the doctrine of humors. This ancient idea, inherited from Greek and Roman scholars and preserved by Arab and European writers, teaches that the body is governed by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. In the flickering candlelight, one can almost see the physician recalling a diagram from an old manuscript. Each humor linked to an element, a season, even a temperament. Blood is hot and wet, like the air in springtime, making a person sanguine, optimistic and vigorous when in balance. Phlegm is cold and wet, akin to water and winter, inducing a sluggish, phlegmatic calm when it dominates. Yellow bile is hot and dry, like fire under the summer sun, stirring choleric anger when it overflows. And black bile is cold and dry as earth in autumn, bringing melancholy sorrow and despair if in excess. When the doctor looks at his feverish patient, he interprets the signs through this lens. A flushed face and quick pulse suggest an overabundance of blood overheating the body. The remedy? Draw out some blood and restore balance. If a patient were pale and listless with cold sweats, perhaps phlegm or black bile dominates. The treatment might be the opposite in nature: warming tonics, spices like ginger or pepper, to rekindle the internal fire. Every symptom is a clue in this balancing act of humors. Physicians in this era give much attention to bodily fluids when diagnosing illness. Urine, especially, is thought to reflect the state of the humors. Our doctor lightly carries a round glass urine flask in his bag for this purpose. He holds each patient's urine up to the light, noting its color, clarity, even the smell. Some physicians will bravely taste a drop for sweetness, a crude test for maladies like the pissing evil, what we now recognize as diabetes. They consult charts that show a spectrum of urine colors from pale straw yellow to deep orange red, each shade indicating different imbalances or diseases. A milky sediment might suggest excess phlegm or kidney trouble. A sanguine red hue might mean an abundance of choler or an internal inflammation. This practice of uroscopy, reading the urine, is so central that many physicians hardly make a diagnosis without first studying a flask of the patient's water. Often this comes in lieu of examining the patient directly. The urine speaks for the body, Not all signs of illness are visible in fluids or flesh. Some are written in the stars above. It is common for a physician to consider the alignment of planets and stars before diagnosing or administering treatment. Medieval medicine does not draw a hard line between science and faith, or between the earthly and the celestial. They are all part of a grand design. The physician keeps an astrological almanac among his books. Perhaps he notices that the moon is in a particular phase or a certain zodiac sign today. A patient's birthday and the timing of their illness might lead him to cast a horoscope chart seeking clues in the heavens. If Mars, a fiery planet, sits ominously in a certain house, he might delay a bloodletting lest the influence cause the bleeding to be too severe. If Jupiter or Venus align favorably, he might feel more confident in a purgation or a risky procedure. This isn't mere superstition in his eyes, but learned practice. After all, astronomy, what we now separate as astrology, is part of the medical curriculum in many places. A good physician is expected to understand the stars as well as the body, for the two are believed to mirror each other. Equally, the medieval healer balances the physical with the spiritual. Illness is not just a malfunction of the body, it can be a moral or spiritual trial. Many diseases are seen as a divine test or punishment for sin. For a deeply Christian society, the Church's teachings infuse every aspect of daily life, medicine included. Physicians carry humility in this regard. They know that no remedy will work if God wills otherwise. In difficult cases, they often advise the patient to examine their conscience, to pray, and to seek forgiveness. A doctor may offer remedies for the body and in the same breath urge the patient to confess sins and call a priest for last rites if things look grim. There are also elements of the mind and spirit that confound the physician's art. If a patient exhibits symptoms that defy natural explanation, say they hear unseen voices or fall into violent, contorted fits, many assume demonic possession. The cure then lies not in herbs or bleeding, but in exorcism and fervent prayer. For instance, imagine a young woman in a remote village who begins to suffer strange convulsions. She shrieks and babbles in an unknown tongue, or cowers as if seeing invisible horrors. Her desperate family calls for the physician. He arrives to find the girl wild-eyed and thrashing on the cottage floor. First he tries a calming draught of valerian root and poppy to soothe her nerves, and perhaps he opens a vein in her arm to release any feverish spirits causing delirium. But if her convulsions do not cease, if she begins to scream blasphemies or displays unnatural strength, the physician will exchange a worried glance with the village priest who has come observing the scene. At that point, all agree it is no ordinary illness afflicting her. The priest steps forward with a crucifix and bowl of holy water, intoning the ancient rites of exorcism, while the physician falls back. His medical tools useless now. He might quietly recite a psalm in the corner, knowing that only divine intervention can help this poor girl. Cases like these reinforce to everyone that sickness of the soul or mind lies beyond mortal healing. It sits firmly in God's realm. While the physician philosophizes about humors and stars, the barber, surgeons, and practical healers focus on more tangible tasks. The immediate relief of suffering through hands-on intervention. Our doctor, skilled as he is in diagnosis, is not above performing treatments himself. Imagine the physician at dawn, after spending the night watching over that feverish patient. The fever hasn't broken. He decides it is time to let some blood. With steady hands, he selects a small, sharp lancet from his kit, a tiny pointed blade kept as clean as he can manage. Murmuring reassurance to the groggy patient, he ties a strip of cloth around the man's upper arm to swell the veins. In the grey morning light, a blue vein stands out at the crook of the elbow. The physician swiftly pricks it. Dark blood wells up and drips into a waiting bowl. The patient winces, but is too weak to protest much. The physician watches the blood flow carefully, believing that with each few ounces drained, the burning fever might ebb. The excess heat leaving the body along with the blood. Bloodletting is one of his most common treatments, used for everything from fevers to headaches to an imbalance of edema. Sometimes instead of a lancet, he'll apply leeches, those slimy black worms kept in a jar of water. If placed on the skin, they gorge on blood, achieving the same purpose in a slower, more controlled way. The use of leeches is so routine that apothecaries sell them by the dozen, and barber surgeons keep them wriggling in clay basins, ready for customers seeking relief from an excess of blood. A patient might walk into a barber surgeon's shop and see their neighbor already seated, leeches dangling from his forearm or neck like gruesome earrings. As the bloodletting continues, the physician reflects on other treatments he has at his disposal. His shelves at the infirmary are lined with earthenware jars of dried herbs for teas and poultices, lavender to calm the nerves, mint for an upset stomach, garlic to ward off infection, and willow bark to ease pain. Though he does not know it, willow bark contains a natural form of what will one day become aspirin. He has jars of ground minerals too. Bright green verdigris, copper acetate, or red cinnabar, mercury ore, toxic substances to our understanding, but in his time considered potent ingredients in the right small doses. He recalls mixing ointments of mercury and sulfur to apply to skin lesions like persistent sores, hoping to cure them. Sometimes the sores improved, sometimes the cure made the patient sicker. Yet, in the trial and error of medieval medicine, even poisons find their place if they show any promise. The line between a remedy and a toxin is thin, and one of many precarious balances a healer must strike. Not all maladies yield to herbs and bloodletting. Some require more invasive measures that test the nerve of both doctor and patient. Think of the unfortunate souls who develop stones in the bladder, solid calcifications that block the flow of urine and cause agony that can bring a grown man to tears. The procedure to remove a bladder stone, called lithotomy, is among the most dreaded surgeries. Only the most experienced or boldest of surgeons attempt it, often specialist wanderers who roam from town to town proclaiming they can cut for the stone. The patient, usually a man because bladder stones were more common in males, is brought in, sometimes already half delirious from pain. With no anesthetic beyond a swig of strong wine or perhaps a tincture of opium poppy, he is held down by assistants. The surgeon takes a metal instrument, shaped somewhat like a long, thin knife or a scoop, and inserts it through the perineum, the soft area between the legs, directly into the bladder. It is a brutal, bloody shortcut into the body's depths. Working swiftly and by feel, the surgeon tries to locate and extract the stone. Often a scream echoes through the halls as the stone is pulled out, sometimes in pieces. Many patients do not survive such trauma, expiring from shock or infection soon after. Those who do are left with lingering pain and a risk of incontinence or fistula. Yet, if the operation truly succeeds, they might be free of the torture of the stone. In an age with no effective way to dissolve such calculi, this horrifying procedure is to some worth the gamble versus certain death by urinary blockage. Surgery in medieval times is generally a last resort and a frightening prospect. A skilled barber surgeon might save a life by amputating a gangrenous limb, but the act itself is horrific by any standard. Picture a battlefield after a skirmish. The surgeon's tent is set up at the edge of a camp, a rudimentary sanctuary amid chaos. A young man at arms lies on a rough plank table, a jagged wound in his leg where an arrow struck and shattered the bone. The flesh around it is foul and rotten. Gangrene has set in, creeping its deadly way up the limb. The surgeon, his sleeves rolled up, an apron already spattered with blood from earlier patients, steels himself. To save the soldier's life, he must take the leg off, above the infection. There are no kindly anesthesiologists here, only a couple of grim-faced assistants to hold the man down, and a flask of liquor to dull his senses, if he's lucky. Gangrene is his soul. The surgeon murmurs a brief prayer or perhaps a hollow reassurance. The truth is, it will hurt beyond imagining, but speed and resolve are all he can offer. He takes up his amputation knife, a sturdy, curved, blade-honed razor sharp, and in one swift motion, slices through the skin and muscle above the knee. The soldier's scream tears through the air as blood gushes. The surgeon works fast, sawing through the bone with a hacksaw in decisive strokes. Within moments, the leg is severed. Immediately, he thrusts the stump into a basin of scalding oil or applies a red-hot cautery iron from the fire to the raw flesh. The sizzling hiss and the smell of burning human tissue fill the tent as the stump's blood vessels are seared shut to stop the bleeding. If the soldier hasn't mercifully fainted by now, his cries eventually subside into whimpers as shock sets in. The surgeon then binds the stump tightly with clean linen bandages soaked in wine, for wine is mildly antiseptic, and some surgeons have observed that wounds washed with wine tend to do better. Perhaps this surgeon learned that from an old master's teachings or by hard experience, that cleaning a wound can stave off the worst infections. In that gruesome scene, medieval surgery shows a glimmer of life-saving power as well as a hint of future medical wisdom. Keep wounds clean and sometimes you can prevent death. In quieter settings, the surgeon's tools find use in less dire but still painful procedures. A barber surgeon in his town shop might spend an afternoon removing an aching tooth. Dentistry, as a dedicated profession, doesn't exist yet. If you have a toothache, you go to the barber, or perhaps a travelling tooth puller at the fair. The barber uses a metal instrument called a dental pelican, or simple pliers. Bracing a knee on the patient's chest for leverage, he grasps the rotten tooth and wiggles, then yanks with all his might. If fortune is kind, the tooth pops out clean. If not, it may break and require digging out the roots. Either way, a mouthful of blood is guaranteed. There's no remedy for the pain except a cloth to bite down on and maybe a gulp of ale afterward. But once the immediate agony passes, many patients find their long-term tooth pain is miraculously gone. A rough cure, but a cure nonetheless. Consider also trepanning, one of the oldest known surgical practices, which persists into medieval times. If someone suffers unbearable headaches, seizures, or a head injury that leads to swelling, a surgeon might attempt to drill a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits believed to be trapped in the head. The tool for this is a trepan, a hand-cranked drill or a sharp circular blade. The patient, fully conscious, is held down. The surgeon makes an incision in the scalp, exposes the skull, and then carefully bores a hole through the bone. It's delicate. Going too deep means piercing the brain's protective dura mater, likely killing the patient. But remarkably, some survive and even recover. Archaeologists have found medieval skulls with neat round holes that show signs of healing, meaning the person lived for years after the operation. We can imagine our barber surgeon attempting this, perhaps on a wounded soldier with a head injury, causing a terrible headache. If the soldier survives trepanning and finds relief, the surgeon's reputation for bravery and skill will grow. Of course, many more attempts end in death or infection, the open skull inviting disease. It remains a risky, seldom used procedure, yet it symbolizes the medieval surgeon's willingness to push the boundaries of pain and hope if it might save a life, while the hands-on healers ply their bloody trade. The academically trained doctors often keep a certain distance from manual procedures. A physician who has spent years at university reading Galen and Hippocrates might view surgery as a lower craft, best left to those rough-handed barbers. He sees himself as a thinker, a diagnostician, not a mere cutter. In many cities, a strict hierarchy holds. The university-educated physician examines the patient, makes the diagnosis, and prescribes a treatment plan. If that plan involves something as invasive as a cutting surgery, he will refer the patient to a surgeon or barber surgeon to carry it out. In fact, many physicians shun any work that spills blood, partly from scholarly disdain, and partly because church law forbids clergy, and many early physicians are clergy, from performing procedures that cause bloodshed. This divide between theory and practice is a hallmark of medieval medicine. The physician might lecture on the proper way to set a bone, but the uneducated bone setter in the village actually does it with his own hands. Over the centuries, this gap will slowly close as surgeons gain knowledge and esteem, but in our era it is very much present. Yet exceptions exist. Some learned physicians do get their hands dirty when necessary. A compassionate doctor will reduce a dislocated shoulder or lance a small boil if no surgeon is at hand. Our monastery physician likely performs minor surgeries on his monastic patients, and the poor, he cannot be too proud when there's no barber surgeon in residence. His monastic training probably included some practical instruction: how to bleed a patient, how to mix a salve, how to set a broken bone with splints, how to drain an abscess. Monks often had to be self-sufficient, and in many monasteries, the infirmarian, the monk in charge of the infirmary, was expected to be both physician and surgeon to his brothers, and any poor locals they treated out of charity. Yet even the best trained healer contends with forces far beyond any leechcraft or lecture. The environment itself can be an enemy of health. Harsh winters bring freezing cold and hunger. In a bad year, crops fail and malnutrition weakens the whole community. A physician making his rounds in late winter might find many villagers pale and lethargic, suffering from what he might describe as an excess of cold humours. In truth, perhaps scurvy or simple starvation. He can recommend warming foods or tonics, but if there is no food to be had, his remedies are as thin as the gruel in the peasants' pots. Come spring thaw, the melting snow and rains flood privies and carry filth into the streams. The water that people drink or brew ale with is often contaminated. Diarrheal illnesses, the flux, they call it, spread through entire towns. Our doctor may arrive in one cottage to find a child limp and dehydrated from days of bloody flux. All he can do is try to rehydrate the poor thing with weak ale or boiled water mixed with a little vinegar and chamomile, and pray the child's strength returns. Summer brings its own trials. Food spoils quickly in the heat, and meat or fish eaten a bit too late can lead to violent sickness. Without refrigeration, everyone has at some point been at the mercy of rotten food. The medieval healer recognizes the signs of food poisoning, though he calls it an imbalance or corruption. The body purges itself with vomiting and diarrhea. In fact, physicians often encourage these processes if they believe something bad has been ingested. They might deliberately administer an emetic to induce vomiting or a laxative to flush the bowels, believing that expelling the bad matter will restore balance. Sometimes it helps, just as often the patient only grows more exhausted. Then there are the foul smells of daily life, the miasmas or bad airs that many blame for disease. Garbage, animal dung, and human waste often lie in the open in medieval towns or are dumped into rivers and ditches. In crowded cities without modern sewers, the streets themselves can become a quagmire of refuse when it rains. Rats scurry through alleyways, and with them fleas that carry unseen plague. Doctors suspect that these noxious odors contribute to illness, and they advise keeping the home filled with good smells instead. Juniper branches, fresh rushes on the floor, or incense smoke to overpower the stench. Some towns enact ordinances to try to keep the streets cleaner, or to prohibit dumping filth near wells. But enforcement is lax, and poverty means many live in squalor regardless. It is in these conditions that diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and others silently flourish, though medieval people lacked the lenses to see the tiny worms or spirits, bacteria, and viruses that truly cause them. Bad air is especially blamed for illnesses that sweep through in the warmer months, for example, malarial fevers, that strike people living near swamps and marshes. The Italian word for bad air, malaria, will one day name that disease. A doctor might advise a family living by a bog to move away during summer, or at least to hang linen soaked in vinegar over their windows to filter the night vapours. In port cities, the reek of foul water and rotting cargo is likewise feared. Many illnesses get worse in hot weather, and come autumn the sudden chill is thought to drive those pestilent airs into the ground, sometimes resulting in autumn fevers as the earth supposedly breathes out the accumulated corruption of summer. The medieval doctor navigates these theories as best he can, telling patients to avoid mists and smelly places, to carry fragrant herbs like rosemary or lavender to sniff when walking past a dunghill. These measures give a sense of control, and sometimes, by luck, they might help a bit. Lavender in a plague doctor's mask might deter fleas, for instance, without anyone realizing why. But despite all precautions, Sickness often strikes without warning or clear cause, and indeed by the mid-14th century, an epochal calamity is on the horizon, one incubated in part by these environmental vulnerabilities and by the expanding trade routes that now knit East and West. And indeed, in the mid-14th century, that shadow falls upon Europe, the Black Death. Even the memory of it, passed down in chronicles and stories, makes our physician shudder. Imagine our doctor, now middle-aged and practiced in his art, living in a town that until recently was bustling with commerce and life. It is the year 1348, and rumours have begun to spread of a terrible sickness coming from the east. At first, it is just whispers, a pestilence that turned the sun dark with smoke from funeral pyres in faraway lands, a disease that kills within days and leaves entire cities empty. Soon those whispers become reality. A ship docks at a port not too distant, its crew either dead or dying with strange black swellings on their bodies. Within weeks, the sickness finds its way to our physician's town like a creeping curse. He first hears of it from a panicked messenger banging on the infirmary door late one spring night. A merchant's wife across town has fallen ill suddenly. High fever, delirium, and odd painful lumps in her groin and under her arms. The doctor hurries through dark streets with his leather bag of simples and instruments to the merchant's house. When he arrives, the scene is grim and frantic. The once respected lady lies in bed, moaning, her skin flushed red and marked with purplish black spots. At her neck and armpits are egg-sized lumps, buboes, burning hot and agonizing to touch. Her breathing is rapid and shallow. Her eyes, half open, are glossy with fever. The physician has never seen an illness strike so swiftly and viciously. Only 3 days ago, she was apparently healthy, overseeing the household. Now, she hovers near death. Her frightened family stands at the doorway, torn between wanting to help and fear of getting too close. They look to the doctor with desperation. He does what little he knows. He attempts to lance one of the swellings, reasoning that drawing out the poison might help. With a knife heated in the flame of a candle to at least somewhat cleanse it, he makes a small incision in the bubo. A foul, bloody pus oozes out. The stench is overwhelming, unlike any normal infection. He cleans the area and applies a poultice of onion, yeast, and butter, a popular remedy to draw out ill humours. He instructs the family to keep the air moving. They light a fire in the hearth, despite the warm weather, and throw rosemary and pine on it to create fragrant smoke. In the corner of the room, the doctor himself keeps a sponge soaked in vinegar pressed to his nose, an attempt to ward off the pestilential vapors he believes cause the disease. Some physicians of the day wear peculiar get-ups for protection: long waxed coats, hoods, leather gloves, and masks with beak-like noses filled with aromatic herbs. That iconic plague-dector outfit will become more common in later outbreaks. For now, our physician makes do with a long overcoat, a scarf across his mouth and nose, and a resolve of steel mixed with deep fear as he approaches each victim. Over the next day, the town devolves into horror. The merchant's wife dies before sunrise despite all efforts. Soon, many others fall ill. A stable boy, then 2 nuns from the convent, then the baker and his children. The sickness does not discriminate by class or piety. Our households are struck as if by a scythe cutting wheat. Our physician finds himself racing from one house to another from dawn until dead of night, trying every remedy known to him and some new ones born of desperation. He burns rosemary, juniper, and sulfur to purify houses. He administers theriac, that expensive concoction of dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh and opium, which is touted as a cure-all, hoping its near-mythical potency might do some good. He performs more bleedings, reasoning that maybe an imbalance of humours predisposes people to this plague. If he can restore equilibrium, perhaps they will recover. He has the barbers shave chicken bottoms and apply the live chickens to the buboes, a bizarre folk treatment circulating in some manuals, based on the idea that the chicken might draw out the poison. Needless to say, the chickens usually just squawk and die. Nothing, however, reliably saves the afflicted. Plague confounds all expectation. The strongest man in the town, the blacksmith with arms like oak, is dead in 2 days, while a frail old hermit on the hill somehow survives after a terrible bout. The doctor notes that once the telltale buboes appear and fever sets in, few recover. Some die within 24 hours, before he even arrives. The speed of it is bewildering and terrifying. At times, he advises measures that normally would be unthinkable. Quarantine, borrowing an idea he's heard that ports elsewhere have used, isolating arriving ships for weeks. He urges those who remain healthy to stay away from the sick, and the sick to stay confined. Hard advice in a close-knit town. Families do not want to abandon their loved ones. Still, some heed it. A few healthy folks pack up and flee to the countryside. Some will carry the sickness unknowingly with them to new villages, spreading the plague further along the web of medieval roads. As the death toll mounts, graves cannot be dug fast enough. The churchyard fills. Fresh dirt mounds appear every day in chilling rows. Soon, they resort to mass burial pits. The priest, who at first tried to give each victim a proper funeral, can now only offer a hurried blessing over the piles of bodies. Church bells, once tolled for each departed soul, now ring continuously or not at all, as the bell ringers themselves fall ill. So the social fabric is unraveling. People start to question long-held certainties. Why is God so angry? Why are prayers unanswered? Some turn to extreme penance. The flagellants arrive. Wandering bands of men who whip themselves in the streets to atone for humanity's sins, believing the plague is divine punishment. They chant hymns in a frenzy, their backs bloody, hoping their sacrifice will appease God and end the plague. Others, in contrast, plunge into dissipation. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, they say, throwing caution aside. And our physician? He does not flee, though many in his profession do. Historical accounts speak of doctors who, upon recognizing the plague, immediately closed their doors or ran away to the hills with their families, hoping to wait it out. Some who stayed wore talismans and concocted their own preventive potions of herbs and vinegar, the so-called plague water. A few physicians wrote that nothing could be done. It was folly to even try treating such an unprecedented scourge. But our doctor cannot abandon his post. Whether out of duty, compassion, or fatalism, he continues his rounds daily, even as the ranks of the ill swell and the ranks of the living shrink. Eventually, inevitably, he too is not spared. Perhaps it starts as a malaise, a headache and swelling in his groin that he first tries to deny. One morning he wakes and finds a tender lump the size of a walnut in his own groin, a bubo. A chill of dread nearly overcomes him. Despite all his precautions, the vinegar cloths, the herbs, the distant seating from patients, the invisible agent of plague has found him. He quietly instructs an apprentice or fellow monk to prepare the usual treatments on him, lancing the swelling, applying a poultice of garlic and tree resin. He drinks his own mixtures of ground-up spices and church-sanctioned holy water. And then he waits, sweating and shivering on his straw bed in the infirmary, knowing that by all he has seen, his chances are slim. In such moments, there is nothing left but resignation. He prays, fervently, not just for himself, but for the town, for everyone. In his fever dreams, perhaps he sees the faces of all those he couldn't save, and he begs forgiveness for any mistakes. The world falls forever, not just for himself, but for any mistakes. By some merciful twist of fate, let us imagine, our physician survives his bout. A few do survive the plague after all, whether by a less deadly form of the illness or sheer luck. After weeks of delirium, he awakens, weak as a kitten, but alive. He's one of the only physicians left in town now. The others died or fled. Slowly he recovers, although he will always carry a scar, both in the form of a residual bubo scar on his body and the emotional scars of witnessing the apocalypse. When he steps out after recovering, he hardly recognizes the town. Weeds grow in the silence of lanes that once bustled with vendors and children. Many houses stand empty or marked with crude painted crosses from the days when people tried to quarantine the sick inside. A few gaunt survivors move like ghosts to and from the bakehouse. They nod at the doctor in respect and pity. They know he shared the trial with them. The physician resumes his work, though the nature of it has changed. Now he spends as much time helping organize food for orphan children and comforting the bereaved as he does dispensing medicines. He writes notes in his journal about what he observed, how some people in better health beforehand sometimes pulled through, or how out of 10 patients, perhaps one survived if the swellings could be made to suppurate and burst. He notes strange signs. Some sufferers had tiny red spots on their skin like flea bites before falling ill. Could it be spread by insects? It's just a speculation, jotted in the margins. He isn't sure. He also records astrological conjectures. There was indeed a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345 that many scholars blame for corrupting the air. Perhaps, he muses, that set the stage for God's wrath to manifest through plague. He's read that in cities of the Islamic world, some think the plague is a martyrdom for the faithful and a punishment for the wicked, and that one should simply submit to God's will. Our doctor, a Christian, similarly sees it as beyond mortal control, though he wishes fervently that he had had some power to stop it. What he does know is that society's expectations of physicians during the plague were both immense and tragically unrealistic. People expected miracles out of desperation. They turned to doctors as a drowning person clutches a piece of driftwood. When none were forthcoming, some turned on the healers, or at least muttered that these so-called learned men were useless after all. In many places, plague undermined trust in the medical establishment, as far as one existed. Some survivors, having watched doctors fail or flee, became skeptical of their knowledge. In a few instances, angry townsfolk harassed physicians, blaming them for ineffective treatments or accusing them of cowardice for not curing the disease. Physicians themselves were humbled like never before. Those who lived might privately confess that all their Latin learning felt like a puff of smoke against this inferno of pestilence. If we leave the plague-ravaged town now and travel to a quieter village beyond the hills, we find another constant peril of medieval life: childbirth. Long before the plague came, and long after it will subside, bringing new life into the world is fraught with danger. For medieval women, pregnancy and delivery carry the very real risk of death. For infants, the first few days of life are a gauntlet of hazard. The people guiding mothers and babies through this journey are usually not doctors, who are mostly men and reluctant to involve themselves in what they see as women's mysteries, but midwives, experienced local women who have delivered countless children. Imagine a small timber cottage on the outskirts of a rural village. It's a cold winter's night. Snow piles against the door, and a bitter wind whistles through the cracks in the wooden shutters. Inside, a fire crackles in the hearth, casting a faint reddish glow on the faces of a few women gathered around a straw mattress. On that mattress lies a woman in the throes of labor. She's young, perhaps not yet 20, but this is already her third child. The first two were lost in infancy, making this delivery all the more anxious. Sweat beads on her brow, despite the chill in the air, and she grips the hand of a neighbor with each wave of pain. The village midwife, an older woman with grey hair tucked under a linen coif, is kneeling at the foot of the bed, sleeves rolled and hands clean, scrubbed with soap and ale. Her demeanor is calm and encouraging. She murmurs soft words, telling the mother to breathe, to bear down when the pain comes, to hold on just a little longer. Another woman feeds sips of warm ale spiced with a bit of honey and thyme to the labouring mother to keep her strength up. This is a scene of tense routine for the midwife. She has seen easy births, where a healthy babe slips into her hands with a lusty cry, and she has seen difficult ones, where she's had to use every trick she knows and still lost either the child or the mother or both. She is prepared for anything tonight. In her kit are strips of cloth for swaddling and bandaging, a sharp knife for cutting the umbilical cord, a bucket of clean warm water boiled with a bit of salt and comfrey perhaps, and some herbs she might use if needed, ergot of rye, a fungus to help expel the afterbirth by contracting the womb if there's heavy bleeding or a bit of powdered belladonna, a deadly nightshade, to attempt to relax a seized cervix, knowing all the while that these are risky remedies. She also has comforting items, maybe a beloved relic, like a fragment of a patron saint's bone, to tuck under the labouring woman's pillow, and a talismanic girdle embroidered with prayers to wrap around the mother's belly, a common aid borrowed from the church. Indeed, many holy figures were invoked in childbirth, like Saint Margaret, who, according to legend, burst unharmed from the belly of a dragon, and thus became patron of safe deliveries. Hours pass, the mother's screams ebb and flow, the midwife's hands and voice remain steady. Finally, with a mighty push and a primal cry, the baby is born. The midwife deftly clears the infant's mouth and nose, and for a second the world hangs in silence. Then a wail, thin but strong, fills the cottage. A healthy baby boy gasps his first breaths. The tension in the room breaks into relieved laughter and tears. The baby is a bit small and vernix coated, but seems well. As the midwife wraps him and places him on his mother's breast, there are smiles all around. Outside the wind may howl, but inside there is a warm bubble of joy. The midwife isn't done. She still must deliver the placenta and ensure the mother doesn't hemorrhage. She massages the mother's abdomen firmly until the placenta comes out intact, then inspects it. They believe if any piece is left inside, it could cause deadly infection. She cleans the mother gently with warm cloths, applies a tincture of crushed marigold to any tears to prevent inflammation, and makes sure mother and child are warmly tucked together in bed. By dawn, both are resting. Yes, exhausted, yes, but safe. The midwife will return daily for a few days to check on them, to help the mother with breastfeeding advice, for instance, encouraging her to drink ale infused with fennel or anise to increase milk supply, and to bathe the baby. In this case, the outcome is happy, one more soul added to the village, and the mother will recover. However, not every birth ends so well. Many a midwife has faced the terrible moment when the child is stuck or the mother's bleeding won't stop. Imagine another scenario, a labour that has gone on 2 days and the baby will not come out. The mother is growing weak. The midwife suspects the baby is in a wrong position, perhaps breech, feet first, or transverse, sideways. With no options left, she might send a rider to fetch a surgeon from the nearest town, someone who has crude tools like hooks and forceps. But before any help can arrive, if it arrives at all, the mother's life is ebbing. In a medieval treatise, there are instructions for what to do in a dire case. If the baby has died in the womb or simply cannot pass, a surgeon may have to perform a dismemberment of the fetus to save the mother. A procedure so horrifying it's only whispered about. The midwife herself does not have the instruments or strength for that. She prays she never has to witness it. Instead, she keeps trying the little she can, repositioning the mother, perhaps squatting instead of lying down, using oil to lubricate, speaking prayers to Saint Margaret for deliverance. If the mother dies in labour, an all too common tragedy, the midwife and other women will prepare the body for burial, often in heartbreaking silence, as the hopeful father's cries echo outside. And if a baby is stillborn or baptized at the brink of death, the midwife carries that sorrow with her as well, even as she steels herself to attend the next birth when called. Midwives hold a curious position in medieval society. They are respected for their skills, often the only chance a mother and baby have, yet they operate in a realm of women and blood that male authorities find mystifying and, at times, suspicious. The church in particular keeps a wary eye. Midwives perform baptisms in emergencies, a necessity that grants them a semi-clerical role when infants are at risk of dying unchristened. But simultaneously, their use of traditional charms or herbs can arouse the ire of churchmen who think pain in childbirth is Eve's curse and should not be too tampered with. There is a saying in those times that women should bring forth children in sorrow, as decreed in the Bible. If a midwife seems to make it too easy, some might mutter that she contradicts God's will. And that's the point where we do have that discordance between the two competing concepts of God's will and childbirth is decree and manage to contract. It's decree. And that's the point where, moreover, in an age where witchcraft fears are growing, people sometimes point fingers at healers, especially women, when something goes awry. The very term witch gets entangled with women who have knowledge of herbs and whose midwifery patients sometimes suffer unexplained outcomes. No one does more harm to the faith than midwives, one 15th century witch hunter's manual boldly claims, reflecting a deep distrust. So the midwife must always frame her work in pious terms. She starts every delivery with a prayer and the sign of the cross. If she uses an herb to dull pain, she attributes any relief to God's mercy, not her concoction. She is careful not to claim any special power of her own. Nonetheless, when panic and grief grip a community, say a spate of stillbirths occurs, or a mother dies, and someone notices the midwife gave her a particular potion, suspicions can bloom. It isn't common for midwives to be accused of witchcraft in the heart of the medieval era. Worse will come in early modern times, but it does happen on occasion, and the fear of it is always in the back of a wise woman's mind. One malicious rumour is sometimes all it takes to ruin a reputation or even end a life. Our village midwife, having delivered the healthy baby boy, walks home in the snow at dawn, weary but content. She knows that she'll sleep a few hours and then likely be up checking her herbs or helping someone with a fever by midday. Hers is a life of service and incessant calls, not unlike the physicians in town, but without the prestige or protection his education gives him. If something had gone wrong tonight, she would have had to answer to the villagers' anger or sorrow directly. There is no board of physicians or guild to stand up for her. All she has is the trust she's built over years, and trust in the medieval world is a fragile thing. Now let us turn again to the more privileged healer, the physician, and see him in a different setting, the candlelit bedchamber of a noble's manor, where his nerves are tested in a more intimate but equally perilous way. Our travelling physician, having survived the plague and tended commoners, might one day be summoned by the local lord for an urgent case. Picture a grand, draughty stone castle perched on a hill. It is early evening, tapestries on the walls do their best to cut the chill, and a few torches gutter in iron sconces along the corridors. The lord's only son, a boy of 8 years, lies sick in the solar upstairs, and no one in the castle can sleep for worry. The physician is led through the echoing hall by a servant to the child's chamber. There he finds the boy lying in a large, four-posted bed, surrounded by embroidered pillows and fine linen sheets, now drenched in the sweat of fever. The child's mother, a dignified lady in a velvet gown, stands by with red-rimmed eyes, having kept vigil for nights. The father, a stern-faced lord, paces by the hearth where a fire crackles, not just for warmth, but to fight bad air. They have spared no effort. The room is filled with a scent of herbs. A posy of wildflowers and spices hangs above the bed to please the boy's nostrils. Yet the child's face is flushed, his breathing rapid with a wet, rasping cough. It looks like a severe lung inflammation, what we might call pneumonia. The physician greets the anxious parents with a respectful bow, then gently approaches the little patient. He checks the boy's forehead, burning hot, peels back the covers slightly to listen to the breathing, each inhale accompanied by a wheeze and faint crackle. He asks the mother about the illness's onset and course. She explains through tears that it started with a chill and a sniffle after the boy rode outside on a damp day, then worsened into this high fever and terrible cough. The doctor nods gravely, understanding this could be inflammation of the lung or perhaps a putrid fever. He takes out a small silver flask and examines the child's urine. It's cloudy and foul-smelling, confirming to him the severity of the internal imbalance. Now the weight of expectation falls on him. This is the Lord's heir. Failure is not an option that anyone wants to contemplate. The physician knows well that if the boy dies, his own standing, even his safety, could be at risk. Noble families have been known to vent their grief and rage on the nearest target, and a doctor who let a beloved child slip away might become a convenient scapegoat if not accused of outright malpractice or poisoning. He pushes these thoughts aside and focuses on his treatment plan. First, to combat the fever, a controlled bleeding. The physician explains to the parents in his most reassuring tone what he intends. We must draw off a bit of the excess heat from his body by letting some blood, just a few ounces. Then we'll apply a plaster to ease his chest and try to help his breathing. Have a syrup to calm his cough and allow him to rest. The Lord frowns. He is uneasy with the idea of weakening his son further by bloodletting, but the lady, trusting the doctor, nods assent. With practiced hands, the physician finds a vein in the boy's arm and uses a fine lancet to open it briefly. A small stream of dark blood trickles into a bowl. The boy stirs and whimpers, but the mother soothes him, stroking his hair. The physician quickly stops the bleeding and bandages the tiny cut. He watches the child's face. Sometimes the bloodletting can actually bring a little relief if the fever was causing a throbbing head or great restlessness. The boy does seem slightly calmer now, though it could be from exhaustion. Next, the physician prepares a poultice for the chest. He asks the servant to grind mustard seed into a paste and mix it with a bit of flour and egg white. This will create a mild counter-irritant to help draw blood to the surface and loosen congestion. He adds in a few drops of oil of eucalyptus, brought from a distant land, a rare ingredient he happened to have from a merchant patient, and some honey. Warming the mixture by the fire, he spreads it on a clean linen cloth. As he lays the warm poultice on the boy's thin chest, the child coughs, a deep rattling cough that momentarily shakes his small frame. But after a few moments, the warmth seems to soothe him. His breathing eases a touch. From his medicine chest, the doctor then produces a small vial of syrup of poppy. This is essentially laudanum, an opiate, mixed with licorice and elecampane root to ease cough. He carefully measures a child's dose. Opium is potent and dangerous if overdone, and mixes it in a spoon with a bit of warm wine and water. The mother cradles her son's head as the physician dribbles the draught into his mouth. The bitter sweetness makes the boy grimace, but he swallows. Within minutes, the opiate begins to take effect. His coughing quiets, and he sinks into a deeper, more peaceful sleep than he's had in days. Now there is nothing to do but wait and watch through the night. The physician insists on staying by the bedside. The Lord, seeing some improvement, or at least not seeing any worsening, finally allows himself to be persuaded by his wife to rest for a few hours in an adjacent room. The doctor sits in a chair between the bed and the fireplace, monitoring the boy's breathing and periodically feeling his forehead. The mother dozes in a chair opposite, waking at every slight movement. It's a long night, but somewhat hopeful. The child sleeps, and that in itself is a victory. Near midnight, the boy stirs and coughs up some phlegm into a cloth. It's streaked with a bit of blood and is very thick. The physician sees this and nods to himself. Perhaps the crisis is peaking. He quietly relates to the half-awake mother that the body may be expelling the excess humours now, which is a good sign. He manages a small, hopeful smile. By the grey light of dawn, the fever has broken. The boy's forehead is damp with sweat, but notably cooler. When he opens his eyes, weak but lucid, and asks in a small voice for water, the mother's eyes fill with grateful tears. The physician allows himself a gentle smile as well. He helps the child sit up a bit and drink some diluted wine. The worst may be over. Over the next few days, the physician visits daily to ensure the recovery continues. He provides gentle tonics, a bit of mulled wine with herbs that stimulate appetite and warmth, ginger, galingale, a touch of cinnamon, expensive spices, but the household can afford them. He instructs the cooks to prepare nourishing broths of chicken and barley for the boy. Easy to digest but strengthening, the castle gradually returns to its usual rhythm. Servants who had been hovering now relax. The lord returns to managing estate affairs, and the lady finally sleeps soundly. This time, the doctor's treatment succeeded. Or perhaps nature ran its course favourably. In truth, one can't be certain, but the family firmly believes it is the physician's skill that saved the heir. They reward him generously with a heavy purse of coins, a warm fur-lined cloak for the winter, and even a fine horse from the Lord's stable for his travels. These are more than payments. They are marks of honour and gratitude. Our physician is thankful, of course. Such patronage and gifts elevate his status and security. Yet, As he rides away from the castle on a crisp morning, he is quietly humble. He knows how narrowly things can turn. In another case, despite his best efforts, a noble patient might have died, and with that death his fortune would have plunged. He remembers earlier in his career a different great house where he assisted in the lying in of a duke's wife. She developed childbed fever, postpartum infection. A few days after delivering a healthy son, the young doctor tried everything. Tinctures of myrrh, compresses with wine, purgatives to clear the womb, but the Duchess died within a week. The Duke was inconsolable and angry. Though the physician was not outright blamed, the midwives and fate took most of it, he was politely but firmly dismissed and not paid the full fee, a subtle accusation of failure. He left that castle in shame and fear, worried that at any moment he might even be accused of poisoning or malpractice. In that instance, nothing came of such suspicions, but the lesson stayed with him. When treating the powerful, the stakes are extraordinarily high. A healer's life can pivot from glory to ruin on the outcome of one highborn patient. The physician also knows of dark whispers that sometimes swirl around court physicians in general. A doctor close to a king or noble handles potions and tonics. What if, one day, a potion is fatal? Was it a misjudgment, or was it foul play? Especially in courts rife with intrigue, a physician can be the first to be suspected if a lord dies unexpectedly. Tales abound, some true, many fictional, of doctors accused of poisoning kings at the behest of rival factions or protection. Many royal physicians in history took great pains to have witnesses when administering medicine, or to involve multiple people in preparation of remedies for rulers, just to avoid being later made a scapegoat for a political murder or a natural death. As our physician makes his way home from the castle, these thoughts flicker through his mind. Today he is the celebrated saviour of a noble child, treated to a hero's farewell by the household, but he remains ever aware of how fine the line is between being hailed and being blamed. He utters a prayer of thanks for the boy's recovery and for his own good fortune in this case. Winding down the forest road, he passes a shrine by an old oak, a weathered stone statue of the Virgin Mary where travellers often stop to pray. He dismounts and lights a little candle, placing it at the shrine's foot. Though he's a man of science, as much as one can be in his time, he is also a man of faith. He whispers a plea for continued guidance and a word of gratitude for the strength to do his work. Perhaps he also prays that he never becomes too prideful, for he's seen pride undo healers before. Consider that beyond the day-to-day dangers of the work, medieval healers live under constant watch of the church's moral expectations. Physicians are largely learnt men, and many are clerics, or at least educated at church-run universities. They must tread carefully not to stray into forbidden knowledge or practices. Dissections of human bodies, for example, have only recently begun in a few places like Bologna, and even then under restricted conditions. The church had long frowned on cutting up corpses, seeing it as a violation of the sacred body and a potential obstacle to resurrection. There was not an absolute ban in practice, despite some interpretations of a 13th century papal decree, but it was sensitive. So a physician interested in anatomy has to justify it as a teaching tool, and usually only condemned criminals' bodies are used, often with a priest present to ensure the soul has fled and the remains are handled piously. Our physician may have attended one such dissection in his youth, an experience both fascinating and disquieting, but he likely hasn't done more. It's not yet a routine part of medical training. Another quagmire is alchemy and experimental remedies. Some clever minds of the era begin to toy with chemistry, distilling stronger alcohols for tinctures or isolating compounds like arsenic for medicine. However, the line between alchemy and sorcery is thin in the public eye. If a physician fiddles too much with bizarre substances or contraptions, he could draw suspicion. There are murmurs among common folk of doctors concocting weird brews or using astrological talismans, even when those doctors might just be early scientists. The uninformed may label it witchcraft or devilry, And so many healers keep one foot firmly planted in orthodoxy. They quote Galen and hypocrisy. They use remedies approved by generations of use. And they invoke God's name frequently in their treatments to signal that they operate within the faith. In fact, physicians often attend to the soul as well. They might urge a patient to heal spiritually as part of the cure. After all, if sin caused the illness, then repentance is a form of medicine. This interplay between healing and faith finds organized expression in the rising institutions of the time, hospitals. The medieval era saw the founding of many hospitals, often attached to monasteries or cathedrals, dedicated not just to curing disease, but to caring for the sick in a spiritual context. Walk now through the doors of one of these early hospitals. It's a spacious hall with rows of beds on either side. High arched windows let in a soft glow of afternoon light. The beds are simple, each with straw mattress and sheets that, while coarse, are kept as clean as possible. At the head of each bed may be a shelf holding a few personal items of the patient and perhaps a crucifix or a saint's icon provided by the nurses. These hospitals serve a variety of needs. Some are more like pilgrim hostels or almshouses, taking in the poor and travellers, giving them a place to rest and perhaps die in peace, if that's their fate. Others specialize. There are lazar houses specifically for lepers, where those afflicted by leprosy, Hansen's disease, live in isolated communities cared for by monks or nuns, following the biblical injunction to care for even the least of society. There are also hospitals for specific ailments. For instance, the Order of St. Anthony runs hospitals that treat St. Anthony's fire, ergotism, a terrible poisoning from fungus-infected grain that causes gangrene and convulsions. These monks provide patients with unleavened, pure wheat bread instead of the rye that caused the poison, and calm nursing, often succeeding in saving many. It seems like a miracle, but in truth, it's an early example of identifying and removing a source of illness, bad rye, even if they don't know the science behind it. In a general hospital hall, you would see a mix of patients: an old beggar with a chronic ulcer on his leg, a young mother weak from postpartum complications, perhaps a wounded labourer injured by a falling beam. Tending them are nuns and monks, or lay brethren and sisters under a religious rule. They move with quiet purpose, ladling broth, changing linens, offering a prayer or kind word. In one corner, a priest makes rounds, like a modern chaplain, delivering sacraments and comfort. The care here is as much about easing suffering and showing charity as it is about curing. Many who enter will not leave alive, but they will be cared for and prayed over, not left to die in the streets. Our physician, if he's in a town with a hospital, might volunteer some hours to oversee difficult cases or to teach the apprentices and nurses basic medical knowledge. Hospitals are one place where learned medicine and practical care come together. A physician might write down dietary guidelines for the patients. Dietary regimens are big in medieval health. For example, the sick might be given blanc-mange, a bland dish of boiled chicken, rice and almond milk, thought to be nourishing and easy on the stomach, or warm possets, milk curdled with wine or ale, to build strength. The physician could also help segregate patients by illness to prevent spread. One of the first glimmers of an idea of contagion comes when observant healers noticed that grouping plague sufferers or those with certain fevers separately can reduce transmission. Medieval hospitals often did try to isolate the very sick or put those with similar diseases together. Hospitals, at their best, embody compassion. A beautiful account from a 12th century hospital describes how at dusk each evening a bell would ring and all in the ward would join in a simple prayer or hymn, the sound echoing through the rafters while candles were lit. The nurse would then go around adjusting pillows, making sure each patient had water by their side, perhaps giving out a final dose of medicine or a soothing herbal drink to help them sleep. One can imagine a nurse at St. Bartholomew's in London or Hôtel Dieu in Paris doing just that, humming a lullaby under her breath as she tucks a thin blanket around a shivering patient. These small acts of care are the real medicine of medieval hospitals. Warmth, food, rest, and kindness. Things that even in our modern times are fundamental to healing. Looking at the healers themselves within these institutions, it's noteworthy that many started as monastic infirmarian. Monasteries were the repositories of knowledge through the early Middle Ages, and monks were often the only literate people in their regions. They copied not just Bibles, but medical texts. A monk, like our physician's younger self, might have stumbled upon a copy of Hippocrates or an Arabic text on medicine in the Abbey Library and found a calling. The church sometimes had an uneasy relationship with medicine, as mentioned. The Second Later Lateran Council in 1139 even advised clergy to avoid the practice of medicine for money, as it was seen as a distraction from spiritual duties. But in practice, many monks and nuns did tend the sick, seeing it as an act of mercy and an imitation of Christ, the healer of souls and bodies. By the high Middle Ages, some hospitals and infirmaries were effectively early medical schools. The famous hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, founded in 1288, eventually had training for surgeons and doctors in Renaissance times. But even earlier, places like the School of Salerno had an enormous influence. Salerno was a unique case, a medical school not tied directly to the church, where Latin, Christian, Greek and Arab Jewish knowledge intermingled in southern Italy. They produced medical texts like the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, Salernitan Rule of Health, a guidebook of health tips in verse form, widely read in Europe. It included practical advice like moderation in diet, the importance of clean air and exercise, echoes of common sense regimen that any good doctor of the age would advise. A physician likely abides by those regimens. He tells patients to get enough sleep, to avoid excessive bathing when ill, lest cold air get into opened pores, they thought, to eat balanced humoral foods, maybe more cold fruits and greens if one is too hot-blooded, or hearty meats and spices if one is sluggish and cold. He believes prevention is better than cure, echoing the old Galenic idea: if a town is struck with an outbreak of illness, he might counsel those still healthy to practice a correction of air, burning juniper branches, or carrying aromatic pomanders, balls of resin or spice, to sniff, to prevent miasma from entering their system. Time and again, he sees how much easier it is to give advice than to save someone on death's door. This reality weighs on him and his peers. The toll of being a healer in medieval times is not just physical, though that is significant, with long travels on horseback or foot, late nights by candle and constant exposure to disease, but emotional and spiritual. Burnout, we'd call it now, a sense of futility might creep in after one loses the 10th patient in a month to fever, despite doing everything by the book. The physician must find ways to cope or risk falling into depression, melancholia, an excess of black bile, he might self-diagnose. One coping mechanism is faith, to accept that ultimately God heals and God takes away. The doctor is but an instrument. And when the other instruments start dying, he seizes the opportunity, an excess of black bile, he might self-diagnose, to accept that ultimately God heals and gets better. The doctor is but an instrument. In fact, many medieval medical texts open with invocations to God or acknowledge that all healing comes from the divine. Our physician likely finds comfort in this perspective. It's not all on his shoulders. If a patient dies, it was God's will. If they live, God's grace, with a bit of help from the doctor's hands. Still, knowing this in theory doesn't erase the immediate sting of failure. We can imagine our doctor alone in the chapel at night after a hard loss, kneeling before the altar. Perhaps a child he treated, the daughter of a friend, died of an infection he couldn't stop. Her face haunts him. The chapel is dark, except for the red glow of the sanctuary lamp. He might silently weep, the sound absorbed by stone and darkness, and beseech the Virgin Mary to comfort the child's soul and to give him strength to continue in this heartbreaking work. Not all healers hold up under the strain. Some leave the profession, a few become cynical and cold to protect their hearts, others redirect their path There are instances of doctors or surgeons abandoning worldly practice to join monastic orders, seeking solace in cloistered life after witnessing too much suffering. A midwife who has lost several mothers might quietly retire and focus on gathering herbs and teaching younger midwives, rather than attending more deliveries herself, her hands shaking whenever she hears a woman's labor cries in the distance. The support system for healers is informal. They often lean on each other. One can imagine our physician writing a letter to a colleague in another town, perhaps one who studied with him years ago, to share a difficult case and simply unburden. Or when multiple doctors are present, as in a big city or at a university, they gather and consult on perplexing illnesses, which also gives them a chance to express their frustrations and doubts. In the small scale of a village, the midwives and wise women might confide in each other over the heartbreaks they've seen, offering a sympathetic ear that few others in their community can give, since only they truly understand what it's like to hold a dying infant, or to meet the eyes of a laboring mother who realizes she might not survive. Yet, it is not all darkness and despair. There are shining moments that sustain these healers, the moments of success, of gratitude, of genuine healing that feel like a triumph against the odds. Think of the joy when a plague subsides and a handful of patients the doctor fought for actually pull through. It must feel like witnessing a resurrection. Or the relief when a difficult birth concludes with a squalling baby and an exhausted but living mother, and the midwife places the infant into the mother's arms. Or the pride when a soldier who was carried in with a horrible wound, whom a surgeon patched together painstakingly, walks back in months later on a crude wooden leg the surgeon fashioned to shake the healer's hand and say, "You saved my life." These glimmers of meaning fuel the healer's spirit. And there is progress. Slow, scarcely perceptible in the moment, but there. By the later Middle Ages, the accumulated experiences of countless physicians, surgeons, and midwives begin to challenge some old dogmas. There is a famous French surgeon, Guy de Chauliac, whom our physician might have heard or even met if he traveled to Avignon, who wrote extensively and honestly about treating plague patients, and advocated for careful observation over blind adherence to theory. Others experiment with antiseptics like wine on wounds, noticing fewer wounds rot that way, thereby quietly disputing Galen's belief that pus in wounds is beneficial. In Italy, Theodoric of Lucca and his father Hugh, both surgeons, boldly declare in the 13th century that poultices of wine and keeping a wound clean allow it to heal without pus. Centuries ahead of their time, they were practicing something close to modern antiseptic technique, though few believed them then. Anesthetics too, see early development. Though general anesthesia as we know it wasn't common, there are recipes for a doillet, a sleep drink, a mixture of hemlock, opium, mandrake, and other herbs to induce a deep sleep for surgeries. It was dangerous. Dose it wrong and you kill the patient. Dose it too lightly and it does nothing. But some surgeons used it. Imagine a more fortunate patient whose surgeon had such knowledge. He might inhale the vapors from a soporific sponge and mercifully feel only a distant pressure as his leg is sawed off, waking much later in a hazy stupor instead of unbearable agony. Tales of such painless surgery might sound like witchcraft to common ears, but they are happening quietly in progressive corners. We also see the rise of university-educated surgeons by late medieval times. In cities like Paris, surgeons form their own guilds separate from barbers and are trained more formally. Some even attend anatomy lectures. In 1315, Mondino de Liuzzi in Bologna famously conducted public dissections and wrote an anatomy manual, trying to align what he saw with Galen's texts, sometimes having to admit Galen was wrong, since Galen dissected animals, not humans. His anatomy had errors. These seeds of empirical thinking won't fully blossom until the Renaissance and beyond, but they are planted in medieval soil. Knowledge from the wider world also enriches medieval medicine. Our physician, for instance, benefited from the works of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the Persian polymath whose canon of medicine synthesized Greco-Roman, Persian, and Indian medical knowledge. Translated into Latin in the 12th century, the canon became a standard text in European medical schools. Avicenna's meticulous descriptions of diseases like meningitis or his recommendations on experimental treatments gave European physicians a broader perspective. Likewise, the surgical treatises of al-Zahrawi, al-Bukassis from Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, introduced new techniques and instruments. Imagine our doctor's awe on seeing detailed drawings of surgical tools for setting bones, or descriptions of how to ligate blood vessels to stop bleeding, things that might have been unknown to him before. Bit by bit, such knowledge trickled in through translations made in places like Toledo and Salerno. Even the concept of contagion, crucial to combating plagues, had seeds in medieval thought. A learned man in the mid-14th century, Pope Clement VI's physician Guy de Chauliac observed how plague could be passed from sick to healthy and recommended separating the sick. In the East, the famous scholar Ibn Khatima of Al-Andalus, or Ibn al-Khatib, explicitly wrote that those who have contact with the sick get the illness, indicating some invisible particle might transmit it. A radical insight for the time. Our physician might not have read those specific words, but through practice he's seen something of the sort. Hence his urging quarantine measures during plague. Now, as our long journey through this medieval world of medicine draws to a close, picture one final scene with me. We return to the little infirmary where we first met our physician. Many years have passed. He is no longer a young man grinding herbs by candlelight. He is grey-haired, his face lined with both the sorrow and wisdom of decades. The infirmary itself remains much the same, simple, stone-walled, a place of refuge for the sick and weary. It is a quiet evening. An autumn rain patters softly against the narrow windows. Inside, the air is tinged with the familiar scents of rosemary and beeswax. A few patients rest in their cots, recovering from minor ailments. An old farmer with a mending broken arm snores gently. A novice monk with a bandaged foot from a bad wound sleeps with a rosary in hand. By a dim lantern, our physician sits at his wooden desk, writing. He is composing perhaps the final entries in his lifelong notebook. The quill scratches slowly across the parchment. He writes an observation about a successful treatment for the cough of the lungs he tried. Likely an infusion of licorice and comfrey that seemed to ease a chronic cough in an elderly friar. In another paragraph, he summarizes a difficult case of the stone, bladder stone, in a man who ultimately could not be saved, recording it so that others might learn from the attempt. His script has become shakier over the years, but his mind is still sharp. He takes a moment to flex his fingers. Rubbing the joints, swollen slightly with age, he smiles wryly, thinking he should soak them in warm vinegar and rose oil later, a remedy he often used for arthritic pain in patients. Closing the notebook, he gazes around the infirmary. The single lantern casts long shadows, just as candles did in his youth. The silhouettes of dried herbs hang in bunches from a beam. Lavender, sage, rue, their potency now mostly symbolic in this peaceful moment. He hears the rain outside intensify, a gentle drumming on the roof tiles. It is the sound he has always loved. It means tonight there will likely be no new arrivals. Travellers stay off the roads in such weather, and even fevers often abate a bit in the cool damp. Perhaps, for once, he can sleep a full night. He stands and moves from bed to bed in a final evening round. At one bed, the old farmer with the broken arm rouses. The doctor checks the splintered limb, asks kindly how the pain is. The man, still half in dream, murmurs, "Better, father," mistaking the doctor for a monk in the twilight. The physician simply pats his hand reassuringly. He knows that in the grand scheme, a mended bone or two is a small victory, but it is a victory all the same. At the novice monk's bed, he notices the young man is awake, silently praying. The lad has a fever, but it's lower than before. He offers him a sip of cool water, infused with a little peppermint. The novice thanks him and says, "Brother, do you think I'll be able to walk to chapel by Sunday?" The physician smiles gently. "If we mind our regimen, perhaps. But, let's see. God willing, each day a bit stronger." The novice nods and settles back, comforted. Finally, the physician returns to his desk. He takes a last look at the glowing lantern flame and begins his own nightly prayer. It's not formal, just a heartfelt whisper into the silence. Gratitude for having been allowed to serve, remembrance of those lost, and a plea that the art of healing continues to advance for those who come after him. He has done his part to add a few stones to the edifice of medical knowledge, even if it's by recording his humble cases, by mentoring a few younger monks and local practitioners, or simply by keeping the flame of inquiry alive through dark time. As he closes his eyes, we too will let this scene fade. The cold stone floor of the infirmary, which may have seemed foreboding at first, now feels almost comforting in its solidity. It has seen so much: pain, relief, death, life, all passing like seasons over it, while it remains cool and steady. The air still carries that faint mix of rosemary and old parchment, a scent of healing and learning intertwined. Here the rain easing now into a soft drizzle, the droplets a lullaby on the eaves. The physician drifts into a light sleep at his desk, his head bowing over folded arms, the lantern's flame shortening as the oil is nearly spent. In his dreams, perhaps he walks through a garden where all the plants of healing grow, foxglove and poppy, chamomile and thyme, and maybe the friends and mentors of his past walk with him, discussing remedies and offering comfort. Perhaps the spirits of those he eased but could not save also appear, not in accusation, but in gratitude, that in their final hours they were not alone. He was there, doing all he could. We leave him there, in that gentle twilight between waking and sleep, a healer who gave his life to the service of others in a time when that was a thankless and arduous path. It truly sucked to be a medieval doctor, as our modern tongue might bluntly put it. The odds were bad, the pay inconsistent, the risks high, the knowledge never enough. And yet, through these whispered accounts in the quiet of night, we also see the profound courage, compassion, and resilience these healers possess. In a world with so much darkness, they chose to carry a lamp, however flickering, to illuminate suffering and try against all odds to lessen it. As you, dear listener, lie comfortably in your own bed now, perhaps with eyes closed and breath slowing, take comfort in this thought. The long arc of history is full of such souls who fought the good fight against pain and death with whatever means they had. Their successes, failures, trials and errors led eventually to the safer world we know. We owe them a debt of remembrance. And in remembering, maybe we also find solace, that even in times far more difficult than ours, there were those who kept caring, kept trying, and kept faith that knowledge and compassion would grow. The rain has stopped. A single nightingale starts to sing in the monastery orchard outside, a clear, calm note in the darkness before dawn. Our story, like the night, approaches its end. The medieval doctor sleeps, his patients sleep, and perhaps you too are on the edge of sleep. May your dreams carry you gently, and may the quiet lessons of that distant era, of endurance, of hope amidst ignorance, of care amidst despair, cradle your mind in a peaceful, satisfying rest. Good night and sleep well, as history's whispers watch over you.